Hi, I'm Gordon Lamphere with the Real Finds Podcast, a podcast series where we interview key entrepreneurs, scientists, and activists who are shaping real estate and, as a result, our world. On today's podcast, we speak with Tim Calise. Tim is a successful investor, entrepreneur, and business consultant. On the podcast, we discuss real estate systems, improving the real estate business model, and investing in uncertain times. Moreover, we discuss wrapping up a successful $300 million hedge fund, and what it's like working with one of the internet's most famous entrepreneurs, Alex Hormozi. Hey, Tim, thanks for hopping on the podcast today.
Oh, I'm pleasure to be here, Gordon. Thank you so much, and looking forward to the conversation.
So before we start off, tell me a little bit about yourself. Tim, how do you get into business, this whole SAS, SAA, S world? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, so I was the kid who in middle school carried a briefcase to the morning meeting because I just emulated those people that I saw around me that for some reason it just looked cool, I guess, probably to the chagrin of my two sisters. But I always knew that I always liked numbers. I like business. I like math. I like kind of just the entrepreneurial stuff, right? From an early age, finding a problem to solve, having the lemonade stand, flipping hockey memorabilia on eBay, that kind of stuff. And so I always knew I wanted to go into that world, and started off in the traditional brokerage, like stock brokerage business. And it just quite honestly wasn't for me. But I had these great clients on the other end of the phone that I kept thinking to myself, how do I get on their side of this world? And so that at 20 to 21, introduced me to the alternative investment world and the idea of hedge funds. And we had a couple as clients at the time. And so being single and 21, I had nothing better to do other than, sell all my worldly possessions, move from the Northeast down to the Southeast, and started a hedge fund. And we were fortunate enough to be able to raise over $300 million in the next couple of years. And then 2008 happened. We kind of got out in advance of that, which was very fortuitous for us. And then I spent the next 10 years in fitness and technology. And that led me most recently to working on the executive team over at Gym Launch alongside Alex and Hormozi, which has just given me it allowed me to scratch that entrepreneurial itch on a new level. And so I've always kind of been in that world. Always kind of had an itch to be artistic in the business creative sense. And so now I help up and coming entrepreneurs co-create the business and life that they envision.
So you talked a little bit about alternative investments and hedge funds. And so for some of our listeners, I mean, most of our listeners are very educated, but on finance, but for some of our listeners, what really is a hedge fund and what are alternative investments?
Yeah, so most people are familiar with kind of traditional equities and bonds, stocks and bonds and things like that. Hedge funds are just a kind of fun word for things that sit outside of that kind of structure. And what it meant for us was we were what was termed a long-short equity hedge fund, which meant not only could we buy things and bet that the stock price would go up, we could also bet against companies and think the stock price would go down and make a profit thereafter. So that was kind of our slice of the world. Call it a mutual fund that can kind of go take advantage on the upside and the downside. And so the kind of alternative investments, real estate and hedge funds will kind of fit into that kind of that idea. I guess crypto now and a bunch of other things would fit that category.
So I'm curious, what was your biggest short? Because we always talk about the big short nowadays. What was the biggest short position that you guys had and what really drove you guys into that?
It's such a good question because I think about the time that we just went through with COVID, and back, it was probably 2006 timeframe, 2006, 2007. In China, we saw this trend of everybody became kind of a day trader. You had, stay-at-home, spouses who filled their day with stock picking. And there was a company called China Mobile that was like the darling of the time, and everybody was in it. And I don't remember the exact stock prices, but the equivalent of went from $1 to $300 effectively within a couple of days. And we said, there's no way this is sustainable. But there is a saying in kind of the investment community which says the market can stay wrong longer than you can stay liquid. And we saw it go from $1 to say $150. We're like, this thing's coming back to zero, basically. and then it went to 200 and 250 and 300, and we were just standing in the face of this, and we just kept, you have to borrow stock from somewhere else in order to short it, and we had a paper loss in the millions until it went from 300 back down to, well, okay, kind of came back down to earth, but it ended up being a 7 or 8 figure win for us. Uh, but we probably went through some significant stomach pain in the interim. So it was ended up the right way. So
Yeah, sometimes it's so hard to find value when retail investors see something different. So
yeah,
I wanted to go and kind of transition into value. You talk a lot in a lot of your podcasts and some of your media content about living a value driven life. And I know I've got a little one, so I've definitely taken a step back in some regards. I'm still working 70 to 80 hours some weeks, but
yeah.
certainly trying to live more in terms of value at home. Uh, can you tell me a little bit about kind of how you came to that philosophy? Because there's certainly so many folks in the hedge fund world and the entrepreneurial world that have this total grind set mentality. And the grind set mentality is great, but it's something that's very hard for a dad or a mom to accomplish and still be there for their family.
Yeah. So I'll first of all, I recognize that there are seasons to life, right? So there are times where you know just the situation requires you to dig in and potentially not kind of find the balance that you ultimately want. But for me, the model started very early on. My dad was in the finance industry and traveled a lot. And so I think as a young person, I said, if I was ever able to kind of find the opportunity or create the opportunity to have choice and have options around my time and how I spend it. That was something that I really valued, and I think early on I said I wanted to be retired at 30 or 35, and really I didn't want to be retired and like sitting on a beach. I really just wanted optionality, and so I have gone through seasons. I mean, Gym Launch was a great example. That was a high flying company. We were probably I believe the fastest growing private company in the United States for a period of time. And you got to strike while the iron's hot, right? But if you look at it and measure over decades and not just the days, I always sought to have the ability to construct a life around my priorities and the things that I really care deeply about. Uh, and so now instead of kind of saying, I'm just going to go and grind for the sake of the grind. I've chosen to selectively pick those areas where, when it is a season of hunker down and get the work done, it's from a position of love and selectivity and not like obligation. But I can still go coach my daughter's lacrosse team. I can go play golf with my son, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think that's what most people really want is they want control. And I think people are willing to do the work when it's aligned with their intentions and their values. And I think we just are now the pendulum is kind of swinging back in a way that I think people are coming to that conclusion on their own and really desiring that and forcing those decisions to take place.
So how do people get to that level of control? Because, like, I'll admit, I have investments on my own, and I do quite well, but most of what I earn comes from my daily labor, and
Yeah.
so how do folks get from that point where they have control, or get from that point where they are working maybe an hourly wage to a point where they have control of their time?
Yeah. So there's two kind of themes that I would bring up. So one is around leverage. So when you're working an hourly role, I mean, I started. I think we all kind of start in that position. When you are an hourly worker or a salaried worker, you can effectively earn while you learn while you earn, if you will. So if you have a desire to create something in the future, that doesn't mean you have to kind of quit your job and then go all in and hopefully kind of jump off the cliff and learn to and build your wings on the way down. You can learn the skills piece by piece that at some point in the future you can kind of secure your independence if you want to think about it that way. So, for example, if you want to start your own business, but you don't feel like you have the sales skills, just as an example, it is more than reasonable to say, let's go find a role where you can become an expert salesperson. Do that for a period of time. Now you've acquired the skills on someone else's dime. You've earned some money. And then once you have the set of skills you feel are necessary to take that next step, then maybe it starts as a side project and then becomes a full-time role. So I think that's, I like to think about optionality, and as a growth mindset person, it's kind of like, what do I need to know to get to where I want to go? I think the second is around our time. And Dan Martell, a great SaaS coach and multiple founder, and has had multiple 8-figure exits, wrote a great book called Buy Back Your Time. And the concept is, I think we as individuals do too much. And so I have a lot of folks in my circle who are real estate agents, both residential and commercial. They're building teams and they're trying to figure out, how do I leverage who I am, leverage my brand, but they're not doing. They might find an executive assistant, or they might find a junior partner, someone to kind of take on some of those responsibilities, so that when they are working, when they choose to dedicate that time, it is highly leveraged time around what is the return on the time and effort and things like that. So I know in the entrepreneurial community, so many people are still doing kind of $10 an hour tasks while they're trying to command 100, 500, 1,000, $5,000 an hour. You have to be very clear with how you dedicate your time and allocate it appropriately.
Yeah, I know personally for me, that's been a huge struggle. So I'm a commission-based driven professional, and I would say typically I probably waste 10 or 20% of my time on tasks that I really shouldn't be doing. And that's something I know I've been working with our team to try to reduce that. How do you identify those kind of gaps in where you're actually achieving value and return on investing your time? Because that's something I know you've talked a lot about. And so I'm just curious, what are the steps that you think someone can apply to kind of find those weaknesses in their return on their time investment?
Yeah. So the first thing that I do with any company that I work with is we do a time audit. So it sounds kind of like you're slowing down, but you have to slow down to go fast to some extent. So take a week, every 15 minutes. What'd you do? And by doing that, you actually start to identify patterns. I spent a lot of time in the fitness industry, and anytime somebody wants to make a change, the first thing is document. Just write down what you're eating, what you're doing, and just by doing that, you actually become significantly more mindful of the choices that you're making, because you're now accountable to what's on the paper. But by doing that, you can start to look objectively on how you're spending your time. And then, again, not to borrow some of what Dan shared in his book, which I'm a big proponent of, you can effectively go through and rank where you're spending the most amount of your time. So there's three things. One is volume. The second is, am I good at it? So is it in my zone of genius or not? And the third is, does it deliver value? So by kind of triangulating those things, and it's really the last two, the volume is just a kind of a multiplier. You should try to find the things where you are aligned with the zone of genius and high value. You should immediately look to get rid of those things that are outside of your zone of genius, that you're hopefully not spending a ton of time on, but a lot of people do, and of course deliver very little value. So I think going through that exercise, a great mentor of mine says, kind of, fear has no place on paper. The the idea of, like, this is all in my head, what do I do? Simply put it down and tick away at it a little bit at a time, and you'd be amazed at what you can achieve in a pretty short amount of time.
So, what is the zone of genius? I think that's a fascinating term, and so I'm just curious, how would you define that zone?
Yeah. So I look at it for myself as a combination of what feeds my energy. I think from a time perspective, let's kind of pull back for a second. People think about time like a budget. Where do I spend my time? I will say, for me, I can spend my time in a bunch of different areas, but talking to people, like, having conversations like this, feed me from an energy perspective. So if I can do this, if I did this for 8 hours or 10 hours or 12 hours, at the end of the day, I would be just as energized as I was at the beginning of the day. Have me doing other things, even for a minute, and it just zaps my energy. So I try to find the thing that I am both uniquely kind of feeds my energy, but also skill set that I am uniquely kind of positioned to do. So I can't easily give my executive assistant certain tasks because being here with you, for example, it feeds me energetically, and it's something that I think will bring us both kind of collective value. So I try to stay to those as much as possible, and then bring others in who that are really good. And I spent probably over a decade, Gordon, doing things that I felt like I needed to do because I was the right guy to do it. And in reality, I actually started to give some of those things off to other people where their zone of genius was that domain. So it wasn't mine, it was theirs. And that fed them both energy and be able to make a living and things like that. So I just think we have to be more mindful of those things. And there's processes in place to start to do that.
So I know you're speaking about other people. One of the things I know you've talked a lot about is becoming a connector. And the real estate business, fundraising, they're all huge parts driven by being a connector and being able to reach out to different individuals, sometimes of different walks of life or different financial statuses. Um, how would you say that you found connecting people, and what are some tips that you could give to that real estate agent or that commercial broker or that GP that's looking to go out there and fundraise?
Yeah. So, generally speaking, I think there's a naive perspective, which is like, I need to know everything. The reality is, if you know everything, then you need no one. So
Yes.
the counter to that is, if I recognize I don't need to know everything, then I should build a quote unquote Rolodex. This goes into the your network is your net worth kind of concept. But like, who do I want to know and who do I need to know to be able to get to where I want to go and deliver the type of value that I want to be able to deliver, right? So as a broker, for example, it may serve you very well to have connections in insurance and with CPAs and other things. And actually, one of my clients is deeply in this world, thinking about moving your impact from transactional to relational, because you're not just selling somebody a home, you're not just renting somebody an office, you're not just doing these things in a single transaction. It means something to someone in the context of their story. So the house might be the home they're trying to build. The office might be the first step in recognizing that their, kind of little idea is now grown into something else. So how can you be the connector to help that person, your client or someone in your network, move towards their goal? Right. So I bought my house. The agent did a phenomenal job. She referred me to a painter because we wanted to do some painting. And he said, "Well, what else do you need? I noticed the grass needed, tending to. What are you doing for landscaping? I've got a guy." And then, plumbing and HVAC. I made one connection, and he introduced me to six other people in his network. It made me feel good because I didn't have to go and do the kind of yellow pages roulette of hoping to find someone. And he became more valuable to me, right? And so he delivered his value above and beyond putting paint on the walls. And I think we can all think of, how can we help somebody move closer to where they want to go, focused on the outcome, not the transaction.
So one of the biggest things that I know, be it a GP or a broker, often struggles with is going out there and making the ask. And to build a pretty large hedge fund, I mean, you were in the hundreds of millions of net worth. You have to make a lot of asks and a lot of big asks. Um, how do you ask someone to fork over 7 or 8 figures? What's the method that you go through, and how do you go about that?
Yeah. So first of all, it's important to recognize, as with everything, the laws of compounding and nonlinear growth apply here. And I just want to preface this by saying that we started with $100,000. You cannot go from being $100,000 manager and going ask for a $10 million allocation. It just doesn't work that way.
Yes. Okay.
So just like there are seasons in life, there are seasons in business, there are seasons in efforts that you're putting forward. So when you are small, you say, what is the value proposition that I have, and who are the types of people that will most resonate with where I am, the state of where I am today. And in the hedge fund world, and what we were doing, that was high net worth individuals who were looking for a better place for them to place their retirement assets. And so at that time, what I recognized, just to go into a little story, what I recognized at that time for anyone who was kind of in that market in the early 2000s, hedge funds were hot. It was like the Wild West. And hedge fund managers had gotten a big head about them. It was, you should be lucky to give me capital, which was the opposite of how me being naive thought the whole dynamic should work. And so I just took the exact opposite approach. And I said, Mrs. Smith, like, Mr. Smith, you worked for 40 years to put this money together. I will make you two promises. One, I'm never going to lose your money, at least big time. And number two, you will always be able to reach me. I'm going to be hyper communicative, and we're going to be protectors of what is so valuable to you. And that's how we went from 100,000 to 250 to a million, and the ball starts to roll. Once we got to about 25 million, that's when we start to go to small institutions, and the allocations were like a million to, most of them have limits on what they can do of 10%. So a million to 2.5 million. That got us from 25 to 100. Once we got to 100, they were 25 million, 10 to 25 million dollar chunks. We got to 150, and then I got 150 million dollars over the next 6 months. So that's a long way of saying, if you are a GP, if you're trying to raise capital, you still have to understand who your avatar is and what your unique selling proposition is. Like, why you? And if you can't answer that, and you can't answer it for the person in the context of what it means for them, you really should go back, just like building a business, because that's what you're doing. What's the story you're telling? What's the value you're bringing forward? And then, who has your core client is a great question to ask. So if I was raising capital today for startups, I would think, who has startup relationships? Who has the capital that wants to do that? Who's had an exit? I have a list of 10 people I would think of to call who I could align myself with, as an example. So that's a long way of kind of saying you have to know what business you're in, and who your ideal client avatar is, and then focus on that.
You've built a lot of businesses, and you've really made a very successful career, particularly out of building service businesses.
Yeah.
Real estate is a service business, ultimately. Mm-hmm. I know we like to, sometimes talk about all sorts of different things, but ultimately we're serving our clients, right?
Yes.
What do you think is unique about the service business industry? And can you talk a little bit about kind of what your theory is and kind of building service businesses and how you execute?
Yeah. So I think philosophically, I service businesses for me are aligned with who I am and what value I'm trying to bring to the market. Selling products is phenomenal. It is just not my wheelhouse. It doesn't get me excited. I personally am drawn to relationship-based commerce in general. That has also naturally led itself to subscription services and memberships and things like that, where you make a single relationship sale and then you build that relationship over time, solving additional problems, solving them in different ways. And that kind of exercise of putting those puzzle pieces together is where I've decided over the last kind of decade or so to really focus. Real estate agents, brokers, etc., are in the relationship business. I mean, we talk about this all the time. About you know whether you're being residential, it's building a relationship with Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and understanding why are they selling, why are they buying, what are the goals, how can you. But I think that's where my vision of, if you are looking at it as a transaction, you are missing the point. So I think we should all think of, and especially in this day and age with AI and the internet and all that kind of, like, the reality is you have to deliver a value proposition that is non-scalable, or not, can't easily be replaced. The idea of, like, I can go and source open houses in your area this week is not really a great value. That they're a dime a dozen. But understanding that Mrs. Smith cares deeply about her house, and wants to downsize because of all these reasons, now I can actually tend to those outcomes. And so I just think, if you can think in those terms, it unlocks the world for you, and then it allows you to be a connector. The more connected you are, the more valuable you can be in kind of that network that you can build around you.
One of the big things you talk about is system building and kind of improving that network. I'm curious, what do you think are the biggest steps towards building those systems that kind of get you through that process? Because there's a lot of folks that are, and you've already mentioned it, that are looking at AI, that are looking at VAs and remote assistants. What do you think is the biggest step that people can take, and what's kind of your process in kind of building out systems in a service-based business?
Yeah, so there are two types of systems, right? There are people systems, and there are kind of call it IT automation type systems, right? And so you have to be clear how you integrate those two things to get you to where you want to go. In the beginning, you kind of start pen and paper. It's the idea of design the process. So, well, first of all, we call it the 10-80-10 kind of framework. The first 10% is defining what the problem is or the outcome, et cetera. Like, what am I actually doing here? The 80% is the actual production or carrying out of the job, if you will. And the last 10% is quality assurance. If you start with that framework, then you say, okay, I'm going to do this manually first. I need to send out a list of upcoming open houses or potential commercial buildings every week. In the beginning, you could do a manual search. You can say, here's how I'm going to do it. Here are the sites I'm going to go to, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the end is, does it look right? And is it formatted properly and going to the right audience and things like that? You can then take that and say, well, how can I use tools, both people, because let's just say you're the high earner, you should not be doing that work. So the first is, can I replace my time and effort and investment with at a lower rate? Yes. Okay. Well, is it a people system or is it an actual technical system that you need? Well, it might be a combination of both. But sending out handwritten cards, for example, now you can do it online. But I've spent 15 years sending out new cards, handwritten cards to clients. Before the advent of the internet, this became an internet thing, an online option. I had my team do it. In the beginning, I did it because I wanted to write the scripts. So you just think about what am I doing? How do I pass it off to someone else? And then what systems do I need? And then what is your quality assurance, kind of method? How do you know it's working? How do you know it's getting the outcome that you want is really important, in my opinion. And somebody, if you're going to do this, only make one owner of everything. The process should be owned by one person. If it's not owned by anyone, it's owned by multiple people. Nobody owns it, right? So be really clear about who's in control of the process from the beginning, because it shouldn't be you.
So we've built better systems and we're trying to go ahead and apply it. What do you see as the number one ways that real estate companies are lacking in terms of applying and kind of reinventing systems to get better ROI and better value?
I think in general, the real estate industry, and I'm not calling anybody in particular, is stuck in the ways of this is how we do it.
Well, that's fine. I'd say about half the industry would agree
Yeah.
with you.
So the question is, if that's the case, then if you look like everyone else, then it's really you're not standing out. So the question is, how do you stand out? And going back to some of the things we talked about earlier, there's a concept called being in it or creating a category of one. This is something I do with every portfolio company and client that I work with. What is the virtual real estate that we can both define and be the only player in? As an agent, I would think about that, and so that is just to put this in black and white. It could be I am a residential real estate agent. That looks like everyone else, and you're a dime a dozen. Versus I am an agent for military families with two kids who are looking to relocate and blah blah blah. Like they call it niching down, but effectively, what is your niche is super important, because if you're for everyone, you're for no one. And I think you take that and triangulate it against what is the value proposition that you can offer to that audience, and you will move from being an agent to being a solution. And what is the provider of a solution in the context of what you're trying to do? Then you build the systems to execute against that.
Yeah. So how would someone go and find their niche? Because like there's so many niches out there in the real estate world.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice as somebody who's really drilled down with a wide variety of businesses, both in the real estate world and outside of it?
So I'll put it this way. If you're looking for the kind of more concrete answer, it's just take the universe and keep getting smaller and smaller until it feels uncomfortably small. That's one way to do it. Uh,
Yes. Okay.
because that
Okay.
by that point, it's like, okay, I am for people named Gordon who live in the Midwest who are looking. It's like at some point you get to to something that at least you can put your arms around. That is the short term way to differentiate yourself. Now, if we're looking out 3, 5, 10 years in the future, and you're kind of planting those seeds now for the future, I believe that intention based positioning is going to be the way that things are going to progress. And what that means is this is the person that I am, this is how I see the world. And if you identify with that, then you're my person. That is more around brand and identity. It is harder to do, it is less controlled, it's less tangible, and it definitely takes more time. So in some ways, you kind of have to almost go like direct response to some extent for a period of time while you're building up kind of the brand and position and things like that. Yeah.
Let's move over and discuss Alan and kind of SaaS lead generation. And there's a lot there, and there's a lot that the real estate world and the service industry world needs to learn about lead generation, both in terms of improving it and also a lot of agents and brokers and GPs are stuck in the past. It's either country club networks, they get business through signs, or they use LoopNet CoStar almost exclusively. Can you tell us a little bit about Alan and kind of how you've built up systems of lead generation?
So Allen was a portfolio company that we built alongside Gym Launch, which was a consulting business, and Prestige Labs, which was a supplement business. So our core avatar, we're talking kind of 2018 to 2020, call it pre-COVID, were gym owners, primarily brick and mortar independent fitness facilities. So first we kind of gave them a better business model. Then we gave them products to sell to help drive profits and revenue and things like that. And then the problem that we knew, but we try to tackle it in a couple of different ways, was lead generation. If you talk to any business owner, I would bet you that more than 90% of people will say, I need more leads. You might even be thinking,
Oh,
I need more leads. This might be you. In the fitness industry, it was 11 times out of 10. It was, well, what's the thing you need to better your business? I need more leads. The reality is, in fitness in that time, 1 out of 6 inquiries or some, call it leads, would actually be nurtured properly and ever show up for an appointment with the business. So when you're literally burning, you know, 80% of your ad spend because don't have a system to actually do something and create value from those people, you're leaving a lot on the table. And so we first started with trainings and here's how to nurture them and things like that. And the reality is, John at the front desk in a business is not nurturing leads the way that you probably want them to. So we built a better solution. We built Allen, which was a machine learning kind of driven lead generation platform. So if you think the entry point was somebody went to your website or Facebook and submitted a form. So now we have first name, last name, email address, phone number. That's kind of the input. We knew with a high degree of confidence how to take that person, that raw material, and turn it into a physical person walking in the doors of a facility. So we turn the conversation from, Gordon, you don't actually need more leads. You need more shows. It's a very different conversation. So we effectively we built a system to double or triple the number of people, the efficiency of that process. And by doing so, we increased the value of gyms. Well, as I mentioned before, this was kind of going into Q1 2020, COVID hits, and very quickly we have to pivot, Alan, to get gym members, potential gym members, to an online assessment, like an online Zoom meeting or something like that. And we were able to do that and do it very successfully. And it took us about another day to look at each other and say, we can now take an online lead and get them to a virtual consultation. We're not limited to gyms anymore. The world is now opened up to us. And so we ended up expanding Allen and pointing it and creating value in about 30 different industries that had similar problems. So service-based industry, businesses that had a subscription or membership type model. So that's, how to, I think your follow-up question was like, how do we think about that in the context of real estate? Um, I think leads are used to how you nurture leads is like the start of the relationship. How somebody enters your world is how determines how long they're going to stay. So I would look at it to say how efficient. First of all, do you have data around your nurturing process? Set some goals, and then do things a little bit probably differently than everybody else. Because if everybody else is having the same problem, you should probably not follow the pack. So what do you do differently? And I'll kind of give you the answer. Speed of response is number one. uh, a hot lead is literally dying on by the minute. So the faster you can get to them, the more likely you are to be able to take advantage. And the second is schedule. The faster you can get them scheduled, our data at the time showed you pretty much had 70 hours from the time they opted in to the time that they actually completed that appointment, or else the likelihood that you were able to monetize that lead would go down substantially.
Yeah, that's not a crazy thing to hear. I know for us, when I took over kind of our sales processes in around 2018, um, for us it was just three things made like 50% improvement, which was number one, we set up a CRM system that had all the data on people, that we could then create follow-up schedules. Beforehand, we were following up once. We developed a follow-up program of 3 times for every person, because a lot of people are a little more hesitant for a large asset like commercial real estate to proceed, and sometimes it takes 3 times. And then the biggest one of all is, as you put it, which is the least surprising of everything I think we talked about, is we set up a program so whenever a lead would come in, all of our brokerage team would get a text that that lead came in and all the lead information to immediately call them. And for us, I mean, we call people usually within 5 minutes at a very minimum, which I'd say beats industry standards. And as a result, our buildings are far better leased than industry standards. So I, I'm really curious, most of all, about your relationship, and I think a lot of our listeners are, with Alex Hormozi.
Mm-hmm.
He's all over the internet. And how did you meet Alex, and how did you guys get kind of associated together?
Yeah. So in 2000, so from 2010 to 2018, my wife and I had developed a multi-unit, 7-figure gym business. It was under an existing franchise structure. And in 2018, I actually ended up taking ownership of the parent company. And at that time, as a franchisee formerly, I had become aware of Gym Launch. I understood kind of what the consulting offering that they had was, and actually one of the other franchisees in our system had I think reached out to Alex or met him or something like that, and then that message kind of made it across to everybody else, saying this is someone you should go talk to. They have an interesting kind of take on how to monetize, how to improve the business. And so I started as a kind of a client, and I said, I want access to the consulting information and the licensing information that he had, and so that's where I started. And then we implemented the fundamentals in our business, and we're very pleased with the results. And then in 2019, that's when we launched, or Gym Launch launched Prestige Labs, which was the supplement brand. And in January of, I believe it was 2019, they had like a launch sale competition. And the prize for the top 10 highest sales for the month was a trip down to Austin to meet Alex and Layla. And we were in the top 5. And so I got to fly down there and got to meet them. And so at their literally at their dining table at their house was, basically nine people plus me. And everyone was going around, and it was like a little ad hoc, tell me what's the biggest impediment, let's just solve it now, that kind of thing. And I was towards the end of the group, and I said, quite honestly, I don't really have anything, because I don't really want to own gyms. I want to kind of do something else. And Alex said, "You're right. After talking to you for 2 days, you probably should do something else. You're in the wrong vehicle. You're in the wrong value vehicle." So I went and sold my gyms. But I now owned this fitness chain, this franchise. And so I had called him shortly thereafter, and I said, "I loved everything I heard. I want to tell the other kind of gym owners in this system to use your IP. And instead of ripping you off, I want to see if you want to do a JV, and maybe that's the way to make this work." And he, I guess, appreciated that. And he called me a couple months later, excuse me, and said, I've loved the conversation. We're looking for someone to come on as kind of a head of business development, a little bit of finance function, but kind of let's get these businesses running more efficiently. And so I joined in mid 2019, and then that was kind of when things started to really. 2019 was the big year. We went from, I believe, 10 or 12 million in 2018 to over 35 million in revenue in 2019. Then built Allen at the end of 2019 into 2020, and then ran that for a period of time. And then publicly, we exited all three businesses in late 2021. We sold the majority to a private equity firm out of the Northwest.
So you and Alex have very different
Yeah.
mindsets in terms of how you perceive valuing your time and kind of what you're looking for in not just methodology, but also kind of end goal. You're much more of a return on investment, and then use it for family time and kind of get more of a value driven life. He's much more of the grind set, make a tremendous amount of money mentality. Did you have a lot of conflict between the two of you when you were working together, or was it a pretty equitable, happy relationship?
Yeah, I mean, good question. I knew at that time going in that this was going to be a season of you know of investment of time and effort and things like that. So I was under kind of no real false pretense. I have to say, Alex is someone I look to who redefined what leverage and output and speed means. I thought I would, you hear terms like, I can multitask, or I work fast. I like being in quickly evolving businesses. Like this was like that on light speed. So I took a lot of those lessons learned, and where Alex and Lael are right now, and I love them for it. They're positioned, like Layla, for example, is one of the best operators I've ever met. She is phenomenal at people systems and things like that. Alex is phenomenal at taking an existing idea that is doing very well, tweaking it, adding different components to it, optimizing it, and then scaling it. Right. My zone of genius, or the place that I like to be, is just the smaller end. And I think part of that is coming up as an entrepreneur. I still kind of carry some of those, David Goliath feelings inside of me. Like I have a podcast myself called Leveling the Field. And I think I just so clearly remember a time when I laid in bed thinking the world was going to end because we were underperforming, we were burning cash. My wife was sleeping next to me, and I'm like, she just doesn't even know how what we might be. And my kid, like, and I just remember that feeling. I think that feeling has stuck with me, and not to make it about kind of a moral journey or something like that, but it doesn't excite me as much scaling a company from 10 to 100 million than it does to try to help that person who's at $500,000, 250K, a million, who's sitting on a $10 million idea, but they're just so uh, their viewpoint is so myopic, and that's not in a negative way. It's just they're just trying to kind of hammer through, and I just really appreciate working with folks like that and being able to hopefully be the catalyst to get them to where they want to go. And if you go to my website, for example, my headline is "I make founders' dreams come true." And I've used this experience as a number two to multiple, now probably two billionaires. I mean, Alex is on his way to being a billionaire very quickly, and I've had the great fortune to work alongside a few others. I take that number two position and look at it as a process of co-creation. How can I? Because I don't need the spotlight. How can I make you look and get to where you want to go and be the person you want to be? And I just love the collaborative effort. that takes on.
Look, I couldn't agree with you more that I think the most exciting thing is taking a business from 0 to 10, more than 10 to 100.
Yeah.
Even though, certainly the rewards are sometimes greater from 10 to 100. It's getting the business off the ground, functional, and building those fundamental systems that really can be sometimes the most exciting part of the entrepreneurial journey. One
I've
of the
learned
things I want to
if
touch.
you set out to try to build $1 billion business, you probably won't. So like we might as well just start building a $10 million business and then be pleasantly surprised when we get there, and then go, how do we take this from there? And that's I only
Like,
use that as a funny analogy because it's so true. I think right now culturally we're like, if you're not trying to buy the jet at 22 and retire at 23, you're a failure. And I fundamentally disagree with that paradigm. And you also have to know what you want. I love Alex. I think he has said, this is what I am. I want to do something that no one else has been able to do. And if I'm going to do that, I have to do things that no one else is willing to do. And I 100% align with that. My vision is just not me being a billionaire doesn't change my outcome. It just doesn't for me.
yeah, 100% agree with you. So, I have a good friend who was in the same fraternity as Alex at Vanderbilt, and
Yeah.
I can attest that before this interview, I sat down with him on Zoom for about half an hour, and I said, "Hey, tell me a little bit more about Alex, just to kind of get a heads up." And he said, "Look, he really is kind of that way, and he always was that way. When he was just starting out at Vanderbilt, he was a gym rat, and uh, he wanted to build $1 billion business from the start. So uh, there are certainly people with that mentality. I take more of the Nick Huber mentality, which is build boring businesses. And look, I would rather build some boring businesses, have a really well leveraged life, and have a lot of peace at the end of the day. But look, to each their own. Um, and I just wanted to double back with you because there's one aspect of your career that I found phenomenally interesting, which is how you guys dealt with uncertain times in the hedge fund industry. Not everybody gives their money back. You guys gave your money back in 2007, and certainly the times were changing, but there's a lot of incentive when you're running a hedge fund to just keep riding the wave and collecting fees. How do you guys perceive kind of the changing times? How did you guys kind of anticipate and deal with uncertainty? And what motivates someone to give back a big fund of 300 million?
Yeah. So I would answer in two ways. So just for the story, we started in basically 2003. By mid 2007, we had over $325 million of capital unlevered. And then October of 2007, we made a judgment call and said, we're effectively taking our fund and going to cash because things are about to get quite ugly. And so I would answer it kind of, and our investors basically said, "You've lost your touch. We want our money back, et cetera, et cetera." Other people say they can manage through this environment, and some probably went off the cliff at 100 miles an hour. But the way I would answer it is, I think two things. One is we were very clear on our mandate, and we were very clear on our process. And I think more so than anything, personally and professionally, where things go wrong is when you go outside of your zone. We had a very specific way that we saw the world that worked from 2003 to 2007. And so the commentary we put out at that time was, by all intents and purposes, this is what a normal functioning market looks like. You have to know what that looks like and what that is. This is not that. And as an example, interest rates were low. Ben Bernanke had just said, Alt-A defaults were going to be contained, things like that. Like the world is fine. The world was not fine. And by having low interest rates at that time, we would, the cover of the Wall Street Journal, I believe in the summer of 2007, posted a rumor that Apple was going to get bought out as a leverage buyout from a PE firm for something like $300 billion. It was the most ridiculous, never going to happen headline, but the stock would shoot up because they're going to pay a premium and the whole nine yards. So we just realized that we couldn't compete at that time. So what I would say is, in any uncertain times, stick to your knitting. I mean, Warren Buffett is a great example of this. Not to kind of quote someone that everybody does, but it's like, what's the time frame you're talking about? If you need to win today and you need to go outside of your belief system to do it, I would start asking yourself some serious questions. And so, I mean,
Look,
we are in uncertain times right now. There's lots of things you can look at, right? The question I would just continue to ask is like, what does a normal functioning market as it means to my business and myself? What does that look like? And then be aware of when things start to turn, because you're going to hear a lot of noise and everything. But just remember, fortunes are made in times of trouble.
look, certainly we're in not a normal market right now. Well, unless you're one of the bears that thinks we are. In in terms of how you see things going forward,
Yeah.
I'm curious, and let's get to our final four. What do you see about the future of kind of the service industry and building systems, kind of as we move into this next 10 years? Because I think we're going into a period of great uncertainty, just like you guys predicted in 2007, with kind of all sorts of things with AI, variable interest rates, kind of a very changing world and a changing kind of demographic in the United States in terms of age. What are you seeing in terms of the service industry, and what are you seeing in terms of your predictions going forward?
Yeah, right now, especially in kind of the general population, we are in the attention economy right now. And I think to some extent the pendulum is going to start to swing back. To use the old analogy, I think very soon the tide is going to start to go out. We're going to see who's wearing a bathing suit. And by doing that, I think there's going to be a flushing of the market, because the easy money across a number of sectors has kind of already been made. So if you think, you watch $1 Million Listing on Bravo and I'm going to become an agent because it's easy to sell $50 million properties and be Ryan Serhant, that is not the reality. And if that is why you're in this business, you're going to get a rude awakening at some point. So I think kind of that's the first. The pendulum is starting to swing. I think because of that, what will happen is we are going to reorient around the idea of intention and identity. And I do believe that brand is going to be the most important thing going forward. You're seeing this in certain areas. I think the attention piece will continue to be there, but I think it's going to be harder to build, and hopefully you can ride it longer. So the idea, Ryan Reynolds, for example, went from being an actor to being basically a business mogul, is not by accident. But parts of that is because people identify with him, and he's using his fame to become a bigger brand. I would think to yourself, what brand do you want to create? And what narrative do you want out there? Because it's going to take you 5+ years to probably get to a point where you can really trade on it.
I think all of us wish we had the brand that Ryan Reynolds or Alex Hormozi has, but
Alex
in
did in
terms of
18 months, by the way. So I think everybody talks about Alex. Nobody knew who Alex was 2 years ago. I remember
yeah,
sitting in his house, and it was like those old grainy YouTube videos that you see. I was there at that time. It was content. It was, function over form. So you just got to start
and
somewhere. And what's your point of view on life, and what's your point of view on the business, and what make like who you are and what makes you tick is valuable. You just have to figure out what your voice is, and it's going to take you a
and
couple of years to figure that out.
and do you think with Alex, it's just like finding that je ne sais quoi, like that element of you that's relatively unique and really leaning into it? Or is it mostly systems based, like digging into the system of how the algorithm worked, or is it a combination of the two?
I think it's a combination of the two. Alex hit it at the exact right time because he is a walking, talking pattern interrupt. In the world of attention, you have a guy who looks like a lumberjack, who is smarter than 95% of the PE firms and investors out there, and is incredibly dynamic and driven. So he hit the start exactly at the right time. He then took that and leveraged the traction he was getting and the capital that he had to go and basically buy access or insights into the algorithm. I mean, there's nothing unique. Mr. Beast posts things like that, and there are groups out there that know how to do these things right systemically. That's a who do you need to know, not a what do you need to know, because once it's ever changing, and he's built a media team now who is the best of the best, and that is what allowed him to take his raw material and leverage it very, very appropriately. And I mean, his recent book launch, 650,000 people a couple of weeks ago, was not by accident. But that was years in the making.
Look, business is always that iceberg model, right? It's 10% that you see and 90% that's below the water. So one of the things that we like to talk about on the podcast is we like to go back below the water and find out a little bit more about, our past. And so one of the things that we love to ask is, what advice would you give young Tim out of high school? Because all of us were very interesting characters back then. Is there, a 1-minute spiel that you would give or would you change nothing?
It actually would be pretty simple. It would be, there is no right way. There is no, this is the way it's supposed to go. I think we are only limited. We're only limited by our options, but our options are only limited by our imagination. And when I was younger, I don't think I dreamed big enough. And you hear that in other contexts, like your dream should scare you, that kind of stuff. It's the dream big, don't settle. And I think that is probably what I would tell myself, because I was probably more insecure at that time than I'd like to probably care to admit. But I think that's natural, and I think that insecurity causes you to start to question, how your level of standards. It's like, if I don't think I can do it, I just kind of lower the bar until it feels good. I would fight as hard as I could to keep the bar high.
Look, I think all of our pimple-faced high school selves didn't have the most confidence, or at least most of us. In terms of ways, though, that we can kind of gain confidence or gain insight on the world, I'm curious, and we love asking voices that come on our podcast, because some of the best ways that we can kind of transform our minds and transform our perception of the world is through books. Is there a book that you would recommend to anyone in our audience who might be out there and wants to pick up a read?
If you're entrepreneurial, Ready, Fire, Aim by Masterson is one that I read probably once or twice a year. And right now, Buy Back Your Time by Dan Martell. Those are two that I would highly recommend to anyone. There's a ton out there, but those would be the two. And then Alex's books, $100 million offers, $100 million leads, are basically free, and they are like a masterclass.
So we definitely need to pick all those books up. But before we go, we have one really important question to ask. And this is the whole reason for the podcast. The whole reason is to go and reach out to voices that are in various parts of either the real estate industry, periphery to the real estate industry, business, influencing kind of the world or the world of business. And who should we bring on next? Because you're a man in the arena, and you know better than just somebody who's standing on the sidelines. Who should we bring on the podcast?
Right now, one of the people that I follow and I'm very close to is a gentleman named Sharon Srivatsa. He is the president of Real Brokerage, and I think is probably one of the most forward-thinking folks in the real estate industry. I would follow all of his content. He took a real estate business in California from $100 million to exiting for $3.5 billion, $3.2 billion a couple of years ago. He is someone that you are probably, it'll be to your detriment to not have in your sphere in some way, shape, or form.
Look, that's a great get, and we're going to have to reach out to you for contact information. We'd love to have him on. But we have one more important question before we go, and that's simply, what's the best way that folks can get in contact with you if they want to reach out and learn more about improving systems at their business, or get in contact with you for consulting?
Yeah, so website is timcalise.com, TIMCALISE.com, and I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn primarily. So, and I monitor all my own messages. So even though I have systems, reach out to me, say you listen to the show, and I will take great care of you. And I look forward to hearing from you.
Tim, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast today, and we have to have you on in the future.
Looking forward to it. Thank you, Gordon. I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks again to Tim for hopping on the podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, please give us a like, a follow, and a review. Your interactions and subscriptions truly matter and help us provide quality guests. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Gordon Lamphere of the Real Finds Podcast. Thank you for listening.